I kept asking myself, what's the purpose of menopause? There's a reason we live 42% of our life post-reproductive.
Exactly.
And every person I asked that to, nobody could give me an answer until I found your work. So let's start here. Just, for my audience, can you explain what the grandmother hypothesis is so we can get everybody up to speed on that?
My temptation is to say that the usual textbook story of us is the hunting paternal provisioning hypothesis. That what happened with these climate swings that actually started in the Miocene and these very dry periods and then these swings in ancient Africa were breaking up the forest, and that had effects on the plants that were doing well and the animals that were doing well. So there was all kinds of response to this, and a population that's ancestral both to us and to genus Pan. So that's chimpanzees and bonobos. Some of those guys who then became our ancestors were drawn into the resources outside the forest. Now, in the forest, where chimpanzees still live today, and same way with gorillas, same way with orangutans, all the great apes, the babies can already feed themselves while they're nursing. Mom is carrying them along. She's feeding herself. They are starting to feed themselves within their first year. And we now have quantitative data showing the number of foraging bouts of these chimpanzee infants by the time they reach their first birthday is essentially the same that they'll continue until they're weaned. And then mom will have another baby and they're entirely independent feeders. But the population that was drawn to these other resources, there were payoff foods that gave you a really high return if you were big enough, but the little couldn't do it. And that is what set up. I mean, there could have been a lot of extinctions around.
Interesting.
But you are mom, and here is the infant. Then if it can't feed itself, then that is a problem for you. It will mean, oh, whoa, I can't have another one yet because I need to subsidize this one. But because the subsidies are not milk, it can be somebody else. And the older females whose fertility was ending, they're still big. Their return rates are high. And we actually have data from these wonderful old Hadza grandmothers who are old ladies, and their return rates are the same. Still, they are big enough and strong enough with these foods. And that means that their productivity, their economic productivity, can subsidize the fertility of the childbearing ages still. And so that means these two things then get favored by selection. Increased longevity, post-menopausal longevity, and shorter birth intervals. And those two things co-evolve down the generations. And because we hung our grandmother hypothesis on these models trying to explain the broad variation in mammal life histories, you think mouse to elephant, whoa, there's so much variation. The ones that take a long time to grow up and are big, and then they live a long time and have babies at a slow rate, like elephants. And then the ones that, boy, they really go fast and they have as many babies as they can because they're going to die. Well, I was so influenced by a theoretical biologist who had built models to explain that variation. And actually, our life history seems so, wait a minute, if you look at the relationship between adult mortality and age at maturity, which would be first birth, when we're talking about, this ape, we're talking about people
humans,
humans who are foraging for a living. So the mortality regime is different than the one we live under. No scientific medicine, no public health, and what is the case is that the relationship between adult mortality and age at maturity in us is right where it ought to be in that model. And that was puzzling because in the model, through adulthood, females are continuing to produce offspring. Well, wait a minute. How can we fit that model? And yet childbearing ends in us. And now we have these data showing it's the same thing in chimpanzees. If they live long enough, before 50, fertility is over. They're going through menopause too. That is an ancestral condition, but they're aging way faster and they don't usually make it to those ages.
Right.
And
yes, right.
And what happened in us was there was a fitness payoff for aging more slowly, because by subsidizing those grandchildren, you ended up having way more descendants. And that's how natural selection works, right? And so seeing that this model, Eric Charnoff's mammal model, that, wait a minute, we fit for that, it ought to mean, if we're right, then we would not fit for the other invariant, as he called it. We ought to have way higher rates of baby production. And that's exactly the case when we have the demographic data to show it. And so there we were with an explanation, but it was only the females. And it was then by beginning to recognize and take on board, this is such an important part of the story. All of us, and this is true for sexual reproducers generally, all sexually reproducing things, including plants, if they're sexual reproducers, right? That do things really differently, but are sexual reproducers. And if so, then everybody has one mother and one father, and they get half their genes from mom, half from dad. And every one of us and every individual in sexually reproducing taxa, it takes one haploid sex cell joining with another haploid sex cell to produce that cell, that zygote that's the beginning of a new individual. So half of it comes from dad, half of it comes from mom. That's labeled in general in evolutionary biology the Fisher condition, that has all these consequences, because it means half the genes in future generations come through males, half come through females. And selection is working on everybody. And the various compromises that ensue from that are fascinating.
Let me just say one thing because I've listened to thousands of your podcasts. I've been studying your work. And what I just heard in what you just said is that we have been so closely compared to chimpanzees, and that where we start to see that we vary from chimpanzees is when we look at menopause. And part of how I even got to your work is I kept asking myself, what's the purpose of menopause? There's a reason we live 42% of our life post-reproductive.
Exactly.
And every person I asked that to, nobody could give me an answer until I found your work.
Absolutely.
And what I'm hearing and what you just said is chimpanzees, the young, are able to feed themselves very quickly.
Yes.
And post-reproductive, my understanding from your work is chimpanzees die within like 3 years or more after they're reproductive. But that doesn't happen to us because the grandmother is so important for the survival of the species that we had to go 42.5% of our life post-reproductive because it was the grandmother that has kept our species alive, and that separates us from our chimpanzee friends. Is that right?
Lots of it is. I mean, somebody like me is going to say, survival of the species is not the way to try to think about things, because selection is all about competition within the species, right?
Okay.
Which ones do better, and that's what changes things over time. I mean, Darwin, it's amazing what he saw when he had so few tools, and astonishing.
That's cool.
I mentioned R.A. Fisher. So the combination of Mendelian inheritance and natural selection, it just gave us all these incredible tools to explain what's going on.
Yeah.
But what Jane Goodall did when she was really getting to know those chimpanzees at Gombe, she said, I put the beginning of old age at about 33, because what she saw was that the rate of aging was faster in these chimpanzees than it is in us. So it's not as though
Right.
females live to the end of their fertility and then they die. No, they are dying at a higher rate. So it's actually very few of them who live through the end of their fertility, very few who live to and through menopause. But now we have these really cool data from this chimpanzee study site in Uganda, in Gogo, where a few females are still alive, and therefore the hormonal signature of menopause in these females looks just like this ape. So
like us. Wow.
we thought that was the case from the data that we could pull together. And now it's really been confirmed.
Now we're starting to see a little different. So one of the things I've seen in your work, and I also have gone back and looked at, Margaret Mead and like her postmenopausal zest, is that what I think is not being highlighted enough. I feel like the conversation around menopause has been, that we slow down. But when I look at the grandmother hypothesis and I look at Margaret Mead's postmenopausal zest, there's a redistribution of energy that actually gets used for our good. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it falls into 3 categories, which is fitness, cognition, and social. So what is it that we are getting so as women, when we're not putting that energy towards reproduction, that energy goes to another resource? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, again, the way I would teach this and try to explain to people who haven't obsessed about this as long as I have, is that what life histories in general are all about is these allocation trade-offs. How much goes into this thing, because more going into that means there's less into this other thing. And so that division between somatic maintenance, repair, and growth. So building this organism, then keeping it repaired and maintained, that takes the allocation of whatever is available has to go, how much goes there trades off again against how much goes into what's called current reproduction. And so the trade-offs there, well, first of all, it's going to determine whether you should continue to grow bigger before you mature. And then I can say why selection would favor that. Sometimes it depends on adult mortality. I mean, those are the best models we have. But what is the case that the more that the future pays off in fitness, the more there's an advantage to be around to get the payoff. And that means selection favors slower aging, more into somatic maintenance and repair, and less into current reproduction. And that's the history of our somatic versus current reproductive allocation. So more goes into, first making us bigger, we're bigger, and then before we stop growing and mature. And then actually we put less into current reproduction. Others are contributing. Grandmother is subsidizing. And so I put less as a mom and move on to have another. And so all kinds of things follow from that as well. And I this is why I keep saying, how did it take me so long to see how these other pieces of what characterizes us are connected to exactly that suite of changes in life history, because it's not only because we get half our genes from males, half from females. And so this slower aging applies not only to females, but to males as well. And we're mammals. And so in mammals generally, not just in us, females get all of the cells that are going to turn into ova very early in life, this finite, and then it just depletes, cell death.
As we go on, right.
Apparently we lose half of them before we're born in us.
Yes, I've heard that, yes.
Keep losing them before we start to menstruate, continue to lose them. If we're pregnant and lactating, we're still losing them. Anyway, that is continuing to go on until, if you live long enough, then you no longer cycle because you're not getting the suite of hormonal changes that would run a cycle.
Right.
But in mammal males, they continue to produce new sperm through adulthood. And that has these huge consequences that with the increasing fraction of postmenopausal females, there are also all these old males who are still fertile and therefore competing with the younger guys for paternities. And the only place they're going to get them is where there are going to be babies, right? So,
right. Yes.
There is crucial in two ways. One is then you have way more males competing, and that has consequences for the strategies of male mating competition, which all kinds of, you can see this across the living world in birds. It's so visible. But anyway, all the modeling that shows when you have this male bias sex ratio in the fertile ages, then the strategy that wins for males is to claim a female and defend her against the other males. And that
interesting
is a way in which we can account for this pairing habit that characterizes us and distinguishes us from the other living apes, from chimpanzees and bonobos and so on, right? So they do not do that. It is something you see in human populations everywhere. And then the age structure of that, the old guys competing with the young guys. So the old guys who are ahead in developing their reputations and so on, then they dominate the young guys. So we get all of these features that are characterized as recurrent features of the patriarchy, recurrent features of human population.
I was just going to say, the more I listen to you, the more I believe that it's the wise female elder that it needs to be the hero of the culture right now. Because what I just heard is that even when men age, they're still, because of their reproductive status, they don't have this major shift that women get. And so and if you tie, I don't know if you've ever heard Lisa Mosconi, but Lisa Mosconi is a neuroscientist that says that when we go through menopause and we lose estrogen, that the brain reorganizes itself.
To know the foods that will support hormones, guess what? I have them for you already. It's a free giveaway. Just click the link below and I'll send you a list of all the foods that support amazing hormonal health.
That the neurons that we needed to keep ourselves in people pleasing and keep ourselves looking, attractive to the culture get pruned away, and new neurons come online that give us more of a social lens. And when I look at her research with your research, I'm like, wait a second. Hello, the menopausal woman is the evolutionary heroine here. She, instead of tossing us aside, people should be embracing us because of, if you just looked at our design, we are incredibly needed for the culture. So that's how I see what you just said, is that we are in a category as postmenopausal women, we are in a category of our own because of this evolutionary design that we are built upon.
We are in a category of our own, but it is the case in socioecologies like ours, the tendency that, oh, wait a minute, I don't want my gray hair to show. I don't want all of that kind of thing that goes with living in a socioecology where youth is absolutely consider to be so important.
Yes.
And especially when it comes to females. And so all of the things that characterize this tendency to want to still be considered sexually attractive, all of those things are a part of the socioecology we live in and the life history that has characterized this animal. And it is the reason that we have, all kinds of both pros and cons, because one of the things that goes with this, not only the male strategies, which initially I thought these were two interests of mine. What's going on with male strategies and the life history stuff? And I thought separate lines of research. And boy, in the last few years, I've seen, no, those things are so connected.
We're in a category of our own. Yeah.
Well, but the two things are so linked to the grandmother hypothesis can explain what the boys are up to, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing I mentioned, this is a different angle on brains, but the thing that goes with our slower development is also this slower neurogenesis, which results in the much bigger brain. But here are babies in our radiation that are maturing more slowly. So as I was saying, these chimpanzee babies are already, before they're one, they can do all this stuff. And where 1-year-old, human babies, I'm just a baby. But because the life history shift includes this earlier weaning, and that's so crucial to why the slower aging and the post-menopausal longevity was favored, because there were then more grandchildren and therefore more copies in the future. The babies who are developing so slowly, and now mom is having another one, and yet I am not able to even come close to think about feeding myself. And therefore, and this is where Sarah Hrdy had laid this in front of us almost a quarter of a century ago, and yet making this connection. And I have been so influenced by her in so many ways, but connecting these pieces, why did it take so long? But so selection on babies to make the social relationship more important than anything. And the thing about human babies is this social precociousness, smiling, trying to, somebody, am I not so?
Yeah. That is the mirror, and the mirror neurons. There's definitely a draw to the adults around you as a human baby.
Absolutely. And trying somebody be sure to invest in me. Mom, what about me? All that stuff, which is not going on in the other apes. That's not an issue. And
interesting
was how selection on that social engagement, the importance of it, that it's was a survival strategy in these ancestral populations for babies. And as a consequence, selection for all this social stuff when motorically everything is so slow. And that results in this early wiring of our brains to make the social relationships take priority over it and end up with
amazing.
What and I are doing right here. So there's appetite. Or can we connect? Can you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You get and you doing the same to me. That's goes with this life history.
That started,